it was myself and about 5 other teammates who were there, including Dan and Josh, who will become significant in this story. They were from Vision Pictures, the people operating the camera and audio equipment during our investigations. So it was Dan, the main cameraman, or the main Vision Pictures guy. He left the campfire first after about 20 or 30 minutes, not too long. So he left to go to his car where he was camping. He actually brought a giant tent, but it turned out to have holes in it, so it turned into kind of a lake bed in there by itself. So he decided to sleep in his car. Then his son, Josh, followed him a little while later to the car to retire for the night. And now, I didn't go through this part of it, but this is just what I recall Dan telling us. But to the best of my memory, Dan said that he had turned on his car for a little bit to turn on the heater and warm up the car, then turned off his car. It was about, by the way, a 2-year-old car, so fairly new. And so he'd done that a few times throughout the night. Turned on the heater, turned off the car, just to keep it warm in there. It was, it was that night. Oh, I won't get into that part. But basically, after a while of talking, we all went to bed, the rest of the campfire. It was actually myself and 2 other women from the team who were up fairly late at the campfire, the last 3 people there. We actually had a Sasquatch sighting, and we heard more tree knock and stick break sounds at an adjacent campsite, which was unoccupied. So that was interesting. Also, it was a full moon, or right after a full moon. So the moon was bright, shining through the forest.
Now, Troy, you said you actually saw a sighting of a Bigfoot?
We did. So I'll describe this quickly. It was myself, the 2 other women were off to my left and right. One of them, who's a medium and has had many experiences with Sasquatches for many years, she and I were the 2 people who actually saw it. It was basically 12 o'clock, pretty much directly in front of where we were looking, or our point of view at the time, toward another campsite that was about 50 or 75 feet away. What I saw is the shadow of this thing, which I think is important by itself, because the moon was generally on the other side of where this thing was, shining through the trees, streaming moonlight through the trees, so you could see moonlight on the ground. That's what caught my attention, is the large shadow moving across one of these beams of moonlight between trees. And it was really Sam who saw the shadow and the silhouette. I might have seen a little of the silhouette, but it was especially the silhouette that Sam, the other lady, saw. And she and I were talking about it. First of all, we weren't freaked out at all because we knew they were around. And so we were just sitting there, letting it be. It was continuing to make noises, of course. We were there with it just watching us for about an hour, hour 45 or so after everyone left. And it was around 2:45 in the morning that we decided to disband from the fire and go to our tents. So I went to my tent. Now, I went to my tent to get ready for bed. I was in my tent for a few minutes, and it was strange to me at the time, but I heard someone starting a car at our campsite. I didn't know who would be starting a car. I didn't think of Dan at the time, but it was odd. So then I got out to brush my teeth and then went back in my tent, and while I was brushing my teeth, I saw that Dan's car was on. No lights on the inside except a little from the computer monitor, I think, but otherwise it was all silent, all dark except the engine running. And so I didn't think anything of it. But I also noticed that at that time the forest was especially silent, other than his car. I could hear nothing. There was no sound except for his car, no people.
Well, Troy, a lot of times when it goes quiet like that, and especially since you had a sighting of a Bigfoot, and, you heard the knocking before that, earlier that night, a lot of times when a Bigfoot in the area is around, and now I've had a lot of people on the show talking about Bigfoot, but it's one thing, it seems like when a Bigfoot is in the area, the forest goes really dead quiet.
Yeah, I've heard that too. And that was, I guess, my first direct experience of that kind of silence in the forest. At the time, it was peaceful, noticeable, but I didn't feel that it was anything threatening. So I kind of just let it be, but took mental note of that. And I went to bed, I think around 3 a.m. I would have been in my tent to go to bed that night. Now, here's the interesting thing. I laid down to go to sleep with blankets over me, and it was right after I laid down to go to sleep that I actually started hearing noises outside of my tent. I think Dan's car was still running. I think the first time I'd gone to my tent after the campfire, he tried to start the car and it didn't work, and a few minutes later he had gotten it to work. Like the battery was dead the first time he started to start it. So that'll become relevant soon. And I laid down to go to sleep, and I started hearing noises. I could tell it was on the ground, but it lasted for well over 15 minutes, I'd say, while I was trying to fall asleep. It sounded like shuffling on the forest floor, like feet, and maybe even bigger than human feet, just because of the noise of it. But it sounded like it was one spot in our campsite that this thing was staying, not moving around or not passing by. But trying to remember how this went. I could hear it was in our campsite, not too far from my tent, but I could also hear kind of an echoing, which I've heard is fairly similar, or fairly common for Sasquatch sightings that make noises. And you can hear where they are approximately, but they also make it echo in a way that camouflages their precise location. And this shuffling was like a sound. It wasn't like 1 foot after the other. It was like 1 foot and then the other falling right behind it for some reason. So that was interesting. And besides that, I had my eyes open for a little bit just listening to this thing. And I didn't see any shadows or lights outside of my tent, but I did see like sparkly lights in my tent, like directly above me, which I can explain after I talk about the incident itself. So I went to bed. I thought I had a fairly normal sleep that night, nothing noticeable, nothing out of the ordinary. I seemed to be in the same place I went to bed in, same position. Nothing was moved. So I got out, joined the rest of the group in the morning of the 28th of August. And it was then that we started kind of an casual morning circle talking about the previous night. We call it a debriefing in our team. And it was in that morning debriefing that it was Dan, the director of Ambition Pictures, who said that he couldn't start his car last night. And that was anomalous because it was a fairly new car, as I said, about 2 years old. So the battery was not old. One of the mechanics and engineers in our group, he said that he changes his car battery every 7 years, no matter what, just because that's the way he's learned to do it, and that's about the life of a car battery anyway. So there seemed to be no reason that his car battery should have died, and the way he was describing this, it was as if his car battery actually died completely, which is odd because then he was able to turn it on again after that without a charge. It just started on its own. I don't recall exactly what Dan said, but I think it was between about 1 and 10 minutes between the first time he started to start his car in the middle of the night and it wouldn't work, and then when he was able to actually get it started again, to turn the heat on again. His son Josh didn't report any anomalies. He'd slept all throughout the night. Except here's the interesting thing. This is about Michael and Kevin that also corresponded to around that time. So as I said, Kevin brought a bunch of gadgets and external large batteries for charging devices. And so Michael was sleeping with a CPAP machine. The way I heard the story is that Sam, who was in their large pop-up tent that they had, she had woken up a little after 3, as far as we figured out, to try to wake up Kevin and Michael because she had started hearing a buzzing. She thought it was the Sasquatch imitating the noise of the CPAP machine dying or the CPAP machine dying itself. I think it was actually the CPAP machine dying, but then somehow Sam went back to sleep, even though she was wide awake. And then it was after that Michael woke up because his CPAP machine was actually off, or it had just shut off. And it warned him, it alerted him that it had shut off. So then Michael woke up Kevin, who told him that he would have the batteries switched over in a few minutes. And Michael went out to use the toilet just for a couple of minutes, right outside their tent. And it should have only taken about 2 or 3 minutes for that. But then Michael came back. He said he distinctly remembers getting back in the tent where they were sleeping. And he didn't remember any missing time or incidents at the time. was later when they were discussing this the next